Okay. Father, we want to thank you this evening. We can begin a new sessions and on the Gospel of Mark. We ask, Lord, that you will be the one that open our eyes and open our hearts, open our ears, and that we can see the things that was recorded for us, for our edification, for our instruction, and for our challenge. We pray, Lord, and that some of these stories may seem familiar to us, and may allow the familiarity and lull us and into a situation that we miss seeing new perspectives and new things. We'll ask you, Lord, and that you help us to be open and to allow your Spirit to speak to us and to minister to us. In Jesus' name, I pray. Okay. All right. Gospel of Mark. How many of you actually read the I asked you to read Gospel of Mark in one sitting? Anyone?
One sitting cannot finish.
Cannot finish? Can one?
No discipline.
Actually, it's not that difficult, to.
Yes, I know.
The chapter is very very short, and sometimes we have this mental block that's we cannot. And uh, years ago, and people attended what we call a kind of a play or a concert, where the only thing is the reading of the Gospel of Mark. There's no props. There was basically the guy just sat down there and just read the gospel from beginning to end. Gospel of Mark. There was a break in chapter 8, then the short break, and then he continues on. So the people actually sat through the whole and gospel, and to listen to that is it is tremendous. If you have the U version, it might be good if you are, able to, whether you are, doing exercise or walking on treadmill or maybe long drive, and just let it play. And you'll be surprised how easily that one whole Gospel of Mark can be read to you. Okay, and that might be a very easy thing to do. Okay, and well, I encourage you. I'm not going to. There's don't make a requirement or kind of a thing. You have to do it. But I really encourage each one of you. Set the time. Read through the whole Gospel of Mark in one sitting, from beginning to end. And don't try to stop and try to think, and just read it through and get the overall sense of the gospel. You'll be surprised what insights you'll get and what reflections you will get. Okay. All right. This evening is going to be a slightly different way of an session. So this is going to be kind of a question answer kind of a thing. You ask me questions, I ask you questions. Okay. On the Gospel of Mark. So how do you want to do this? You want me to ask questions first, or you want to ask questions of me first? I can either ask you questions or you can ask me questions.
Ask the pastor.
Yeah, ask. Okay. All right. What when you think of the Gospel of Mark, what comes first in your mind? What do you think this book is all about? What then this New Testament book is all about?
Kingdom of God.
Kingdom of God. Okay.
Jesus' ministry.
Jesus' ministry. New York says.
Yeah, he does a lot of miracles.
Okay.
A lot of stories about miracles, how the healing, power, sicknesses, evil spirit,
Okay, exorcisms. Okay. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, why would you want to read the Gospel of Mark?
Shortest gospel.
Shortest Gospel. Okay, it's a shortest gospel. Okay, good. Anyone else? So don't want to do a long one, get the shortest gospel, read the shortest gospel. Why do you want to read the Gospel of Mark?
To know about Jesus' teaching and his work, and to learn from there.
Okay.
His teaching and his work and his power and his love, and I think that's what I
Okay.
yes.
Anyone else? Now let me put it in a different way. Okay. Almost everything in Mark's Gospel can be found in either Matthew or Luke, and even larger context. So if everything in Mark's Gospel is found in Matthew or Luke, why bother reading the book of Mark?
Get an overall picture.
The overall
Yes.
picture. Okay. Okay.
Who is this Mark anyway?
Who is this Mark anyway? Yeah, who is this Mark anyway? Anyone like to know who is the author of this book? Why is it called Mark? Because supposedly Mark wrote it, is it? There's nothing in the book that identify the author, right? If you have read the whole book, you don't find Mark's name mentioned, no. And when you read the letters of Paul, then you see that Paul says, "I write this letter." Or then when you look at Revelation, John says, "I, John," then write this, and but in the Gospel, none of them identify himself or herself as a writer. So who is the one who wrote this Gospel? Mark. Yeah. Who is Mark? Anyone? No? Bible quiz. Who is Mark? He's the author of Mark's Gospel. But who is he?
Supposedly John Mark.
John Mark. And who supposedly is John Mark?
Was he the one who was with that time when Paul actually refused to be his partner? Was he the one?
All right. Book of Acts, there was record of John and Mark. And Paul then took him along. Barnabas wanted to take him along. Barnabas and wanted to take John Mark and along. And when Paul and Barnabas went for their missionary journey, Mark somehow turned back, and there was the first missionary journey, and Mark then decided to turn back. No reason was given why he decided not to continue. And so he went home. The rest of the missionary party continued their missions. And then when Paul and Barnabas wanted to go for a second journey, want to take along and want to revisit the church, and Barnabas wanted to take along John Mark again, Paul refused. No, he says, and there was a big disagreement, and there was a split between Paul and Barnabas. So Paul took Silas, Barnabas took Mark. That was the John Mark, right? Anything else that we know about John Mark? Later, there seemed to be some reconciliation between Paul and Mark. And Paul says that he's useful, then bring Mark, and I think writing to Timothy, bring Mark along, and he's been helpful to me. And okay, then there was also a reference on Peter and mentioning about Mark. So in a sense, John Mark is, and he is the son of Mary in the book of Acts, and the church in Jerusalem used to meet at their home, and so it's very likely that John Mark is not one of the original disciples of Jesus. He was probably too young to be the follower. He could be, we'll say, second generation follower, second generation Christian. He seems to have assisted Peter, and during Peter's last years in Rome, and the tradition of the church indicates that John Mark wrote down and was instructed by Peter to write down his gospel, the gospel for the church. And so this is considered as Peter's memoirs, and what Peter remembered and about the stories. Okay, that is a traditional understanding. Many conservative Christians, scholars, still hold their position, but more critical and more liberal scholars to think that is a kind of a fiction, and it was written to give kind of a defense and authority, because the Gospels, in order to have some kind of acceptance in the church, ought to be written by an apostle or some close associated apostles. So Matthew, original disciple of Jesus, then John, original disciple of Jesus, Luke, and who wrote Luke, was a very close disciple and follow and associate of Paul. So that is Paul's version of the gospel. And there's need to give credentials to Mark and make him associate, assistant, and to Peter. So you have the gospel's foundation in Matthew, in John, and in Luke, in Paul, and in Peter. But many scholars who are a little bit more critical do not think that possibly John Mark could be the writer, but many of them think that the writer is likely anonymous. My own and professor, I studied John Mark under him, and Robert Gulick. He is one of those who thinks that more likely we don't know who wrote the gospel. Okay. All right. Whether John Mark wrote the gospel or someone wrote the gospel, a question that would come up is that why was this book written? What was the purpose for writing this book? Anybody? Why do you think Mark wrote this book? Anybody?
I read somewhere
Yes.
that why Mark wrote about this one is actually Peter's first-hand experience, and because Peter is very close associated with Jesus,
Okay.
so this is what I understand that Mark wrote about this, the first-hand experience, of Peter.
Peter. Okay. All right. Okay. So Peter wants to leave his legacy and commission John to write, is it?
Yes.
Why didn't Peter write himself? Peter wrote 2 letters. Why didn't he write the gospel himself? Incidentally, there is some books called the Gospel of Peter. That is forgeries. There was nothing to do with Peter, but is written in Peter's name. Okay, what was the purpose? Why did John? Is it just basically because he wants to record Peter's first-hand experience of Jesus? Keelan?
Has it got to do with the world that Mark was exposed to after Jesus, and he collected? I mean, when we say he, means whoever wrote it.
Let's say
Collected like witnesses, stories, and all that in relation to the world that he lived in, which was, I think, Roman.
Okay.
It's no longer the
Roman?
the Jewish thing. I'm just guessing.
It's not a Roman?
No, I mean the world, the Roman world that
Okay.
he was exposed to in his travels.
Okay. Something like Mark wrote as a kind of a gospel, as an evangelistic tract, and as kind of a evangelizing tool for Roman audience, to Roman Gentiles, to explain who this Jesus is. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so, because the book of Mark has all these short, like somebody mentioned just now, the short gospel, but it's also very short, very concise, and it's like a a retelling of what it was about.
Right. So the idea is that the Jews like all these laws, all these teachings, and all that, and stuff, and the Jews like. So Matthew wrote it that way. And Greeks like long stories and things like that. And Greeks are then more literary, more than educated, and things like that. Would like the kind of stories that Luke writes. And so Romans are very busybodies and busy people, and they have very short attention span. They can't stand long stories. So it's a short kind of things for them, is it? And so Mark was the shortest gospel, and so it was written for them. And because these people don't have time to deal with all the long-winded kind of thing, the genealogies and all. They just want what Jesus did, what Jesus said. That's it. Is that the sense that you get?
I guess so.
Okay.
Because it's like somebody is retelling what it was and recap
All right.
what was done.
All right. Okay. Do you know, anybody know when the Gospel of Mark is supposedly written? What year? Date of publishing, publication date. When was the Gospel of Mark written? Anyone has any idea? In your readings and in your Sunday school, in your Bible studies, and in church. Leping?
Don't know lah, Pastor.
No. Okay. Lawrence?
Don't know lah, Pastor.
Maybe it was taught, it was mentioned, and it's all this arcane stuff you don't really remember. And after I tell you, then and 1 month later, you also don't remember. But okay, it's all right. Most likely, and the Gospels were not the first things that were written in the New Testament. And the first writings in the New Testament are actually Paul's letters. Okay. The Gospels was written much later than the letters. It's kind of strange because in the New Testament, we have the Gospels first, then we have the letters. So the initial impression is that the Gospels were written first, and then the letters were written to explain the Gospel. Okay. No, it's the other way around. The letters of Paul was written probably in the early 50s, and the Gospel was written then. Incidentally, even though there are still some people who think that Matthew wrote the first Gospel, majority of New Testament scholars and New Testament and those who are, whether they're liberal, evangelical, whatever, would say that Mark was the first gospel to be written. And then Matthew and Luke borrowed or copied large portions of Mark's gospel with portions of another source. And for Matthew and for the materials that are not found in Mark's gospel is come from what we call a source, a Q. There's no written document, and but a series of teachings and sayings of Jesus that is not found in Mark, and Luke and Matthew has in common. All right, and Luke has it scattered all over his gospel. Matthew have it in chunks, and 5 basic chunks of teaching throughout his gospel. And in Mark's gospel, and they call it Q. Q is a German, and it's a letter for German word for Quille, and means source. Basically, so Mark seems to be the first gospel to be written, and then Matthew and Luke borrowed from him. A minority, small minority, but very vocal, and would say that Matthew is the first gospel written, and Mark condensed it and got rid of all the extraordinary things, and then Luke came along, and Luke took Mark's and Matthew's and redo a third gospel. So, and some would say that Mark first, Matthew first, then Mark, and then Luke. But most scholars think that Mark was the first gospel written, and then Matthew later, and Luke later. And so it's very likely that Mark is the first gospel written, and it's probably written around the middle of the 60s. And in Rome, and when I think Nero was the emperor at that time, and so Mark wrote the gospel in Rome in the mid-60s, just before the execution of Paul and Peter, before they were executed by the emperor Nero. So think about that for a while. Jesus died, ministry is around the early 30s. He died around AD 33, give and take a bit, and we can't be exact on the dates. So the Gospel of Mark was written 30 years after Jesus' ministry, his teaching, his actions, his works, his miracles, and all that. 30 years after what happened. For some people, it's wow, so long. For others, say it's quite short. Okay, and it depends on the perspective. But for 30 years, let's imagine there was no gospel written. There was no written gospel. Does it mean that for 30 years, as the church grew, if you read the book of Acts, they grew very, very, very quickly after the day of Pentecost, the church grew and all that. The church didn't have a New Testament. Yeah, they didn't have a New Testament. They have the Bible, the Old Testament, and they have the stories of Jesus. They remembered the teachings, they remembered the miracles, but they were not written. They were bits and pieces all along, all gone. It's almost like the situation, let's say you have a church and you don't have a Bible. You don't have what we call Bible to read and things like that. So you go every Sunday or every other day to go to church, and the pastor tells you the story and about Jesus' miracles, a story about Jesus' teaching, and things like that. All you have is the pastors telling you stories of Jesus and his teachings and all that, and this has been done for 30 years in your life. Nothing written. All you have here is every Sunday you go, you listen to the stories, and then on Good Friday, Easter, Lent period, you will have extended readings and of what we call or retelling of the last days of Jesus' life. So this is what is going on. Just imagine there was no written records. Now, how does that make you feel? But how do you react to that? What is your response to that? Have you ever thought about it in this way? Kiran? Opinion?
Pastor, when you shared that, is it somewhat like Christians going to church, they don't read the Bible, they just listen to what the pastor say?
Pastor
you
said.
know, and taking lock, stock, and barrel.
Yeah. They're basically then well, there are ways to verify what they say about what is said about Jesus, and just as people who then the pastor tell about testimonies and whether he's making up the story or whether it's actually happened and in his life and things like that. There's way to check, and people can this story is not real one, or that story is not real, because they are witnesses. There are people who saw, people who actually then can say, yeah, that's what happened. That's what Jesus said. All right. So the trustworthiness of the gospel stories is actually not in doubt, because there were eyewitnesses. It's not as if some missionaries went to overseas and tell stories about Jesus up to complete strangers. These stories were told and retold, and in the earliest churches in Jerusalem, in Galilee, and in places where people can still remember the actual words and actual deeds of Jesus. In fact, this is where, and it's kind of interesting. Today, we tend to depend on written records, right?
Yeah.
We tend, what is written, then it's more we call then authoritative, so to speak. Of course, now with all the social media and fake news, we are beginning not to pay attention to that, and going to question that a little bit. But what the early church did was that they actually pay more attention to the oral reports of actual witnesses. Okay, people who knew about those events, people who tell the story to trustworthy and what we call then any of we call stories, and that somehow distort the story can be corrected almost and very quickly, and because the words of Jesus are treated as sacred in the one sense. The miracles of Jesus were treated as sacred because this is part of holy history, and so there is what we call a great and care that people has. So when Mark wrote the story, the gospel, it is not as if the church, but they can, the direction is not, this is the first time we heard this story, so we didn't know that Jesus did this, Jesus did that. No. They can verify that what Mark wrote is correct, is trustworthy. Okay? And they can point to people and traditions and things like that will say that Mark is a trustworthy storyteller of Jesus. It's important to know that. Okay? Now, but it begs the question, if these stories are all written and all been told in the churches and repeated every week, and whether they gather together then on a daily basis, or whether they come for worship once a week and to worship, and why would Mark and Matthew and Luke saw it important to write down the stories? And why didn't they write down the stories in the first place, much earlier? Why wait 30 years later before they write down the stories? Anyone like to speculate? This this all because we cannot ask Mark why you write it, or ask Peter why you write it, and but use some common sense and make some intelligent guesses.
Would it be somewhat like we endorse by writing, we endorse that these things did happen?
Okay.
I mean, even ourselves, if we were to write something now that happened 30 years ago, maybe to affirm what happened as a record.
Okay. It might seem to us, and in our modern time, that be the case. As I said, most of us, and in the modern age, and tends to give more attention to what is written, and rather than what is said. However, in the early centuries, and even the second century, there were writings that of the early teachers and or second generation leaders that gave more we call weight to the oral tradition rather than the written records. Okay, and possibly because there were a lot of other written records that are fake. There are a lot of fake news. There are a lot of fake stories that go around and circulated under the various names or whatever it is. But what is transmitted orally in the church, that is what we call the official version, okay, and is given more authority. And I think it was some early fathers, church fathers in the second century, they said very clearly, I give more weight to what is said than to what is written. Okay, because in one sense, anybody can write, and so many of the writings are anonymous. Okay, but when someone said something, we ask who said it. We heard somebody say it, and if it's a false teacher to say it, we ignore it. If it's a authoritative, respected teacher who says it, we endorse it, we accept it. It's kind of, you need to get your mind around that kind of a situation. Okay, but why was it found necessary to put these stories in writing in the mid-60s?
So wouldn't time would tell that oral tradition will get distorted along the way? I mean, I can be a witness,
Yeah.
right? And I know what happened, but if after 30, 50 years, I'm no longer there, the next person that comes along may not know as much. And whoever is going to share whatever the gospel or the message, who is there to verify?
Okay. All right. Now then, again, you can distort, but you cannot. And again, you can be corrected almost instantaneously, and by people who say, what you're telling is not right." And now, there is also this important thing that we need to know, that the stories of Jesus and was not written in the form of this word, the exact words that Jesus spoke. Okay, and the evangelicals and we conservative have this doctrine of inspiration and inerrancy and all that, and I think in one sense it serves a purpose, but in another sense it distorts our understanding. For one thing, the Gospels were written in Greek, and Jesus spoke in Aramaic. So these were not the actual words of Jesus. This was the Greek rendering of Jesus' words. It's like, and we say something in English, and someone report it in Chinese.
Pastors or the church leaders sharing? Were they sharing in Aramaic? Were they sharing in Greek?
In
He
Palestine,
has Greek, right?
in Palestinian communities, probably they were all in Aramaic. But they were also what we call it was bilingual. In the early church, you look at the book of Acts, there were Greek-speaking Christians. There were also Hebrew-speaking Christians in the book of Acts chapter 6. The Greek-speaking Jews and Christians, believers, and the Aramaic-speaking. Eventually, the Aramaic speakers become more smaller and smaller as more and more Gentiles and more we call and Greek speakers. So there was somehow slowly a change. It is like this, then you are in Sabah, then you all the sermons and the worship is all in Bahasa, and then you come to Malaysia, and you go to big town churches, and then you find that there are not very many Bahasa speaking churches. Then you go to English speaking churches, they speak English, and the transition. You tend to have a bilingual kind of a thing. And eventually you kind of assimilate, and slowly the what we call native language becomes overshadowed by the more common universal language, the lingua franca. At that time, everybody speak Greek. That was the universal language. Everybody, there was a language of commerce. There was a language of and what we call, although in the Roman Empire, Latin is the official Roman language, but all educated Romans speak Greek. All Jewish leaders in the community speak Greek, just as you are Chinese, and we all know Cantonese, we all know Mandarin, we all know Hokkien, but in this Bible study is in English. So eventually it's all in English. So you find that the New Testament was written in Greek, and so there need to be a kind of a translation of the words of Jesus into Greek. And that becomes what we call, and as time goes on, from the 40s to the 50s to the 60s, predominantly the language was Greek. And the stories, and the Syriac Christians still have Aramaic portions of the scriptures. And so they still claim that they were Aramaic. They have the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic in the Syrian Orthodox Church. They say this is the language that Jesus spoke, and this is the prayer that Jesus prayed. And but most of the Christians will then pray and in Greek. Okay. So that is an interesting kind of situation. So when the gospel was written, it was all written in Greek, and time is getting up, and so I need to kind of wrap it up a little bit. There are many reasons that we can think, and we can assume, and we can speculate that, and that the gospel writers, especially Mark, wrote the gospel. He was the first to write gospel. One very obvious possible reason is that, and the original disciples were in danger of dying and in danger of being killed. The early church actually have a sense of imminence of Jesus coming. Jesus says he'll come again. And there were certain reports that, before this generation passed away, then this generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. So there was a kind of a danger that, and as long as they were living, the leadership, the apostles and the associated apostles and the leaders and all that, they can basically authorize and keep and the gospel from being distorted and while they were living. But now they are dying. Peter's already said that he's ready to die. So he wants to leave a kind of a testament. He wants to leave a kind of so he commissioned Mark to write down and the main stories that the church has about Jesus. And that is a very, very likely reason. Okay. And then Matthew and Luke saw what Mark did. He did a incredible job, but he missed out certain things. So they want to supplement it and they want to add it on. And whether Matthew and Luke know each other, we don't know. But each one for the more Jewish and one for the more Greek, and they decided to then have kind of extended and gospels, and that is possibly one probably and very likely major reason. And there's no way to write and put into, because writing takes time, and publishing and recording and copying and send. You write down is one copy. You must writing is not just like today publishing. You send to the publisher and then because copying scriptures is a very, very tedious process, and there are not many people who are literate in the first place. Okay, one also reason is that the gospel is not written because many people do not read. Okay, there's no point of writing the gospels when no one is able to read it. Most people only hear; they can listen. And so the letter is written, and then the letter is read out to the people. So in the churches, probably, I don't know, maybe 10% or even 5% people can read. So you are asking for people to have the Bibles to read? No, or the Gospels read. They don't. Even if they have it, they can't read it. They don't know how to read it. So then, so they have to listen to the Gospels. They have to listen to the stories. They have to tell me the stories of Jesus, what he did, and the stories, and those stories are written. So, but the time has come when the leaders are fading away or dying or being killed, and there must be need to some kind of a deposit of the stories. And so there's one very good reason that after 30 years, Jesus did not return. If Jesus returned within that time, there's no need to write down. And because we're going to heaven anyway, Jesus come and we will take in the new kingdom. There's no need to write down the stories because we don't have to pass it to the next generation. So that's one possible and probably main reason. But there are also other reasons, and you'll find that particular reasons will seem to say, if you look at the way Matthew write and the way Luke write and the way Mark write, they seem to have written for other, possibly, if not as important, but still important reasons. And one of the things that I think modern scholars have seen about Mark's gospel, Mark was written to prepare the church for persecution. There was imminent persecution. Peter is going to be killed, and Paul is going to be killed, and they already have a sense that these leaders and a lot of leaders, so they need these stories of Jesus written in a way to encourage the church to be faithful in times of persecution. There are many, many stories of Jesus. There are many, many teachings of Jesus. Okay? And John himself said that if all the stories of Jesus were collected and published, there is not enough. Of course, it's exaggerating. But Mark has to select which stories to write, which stories to include. Because now, one thing about a very interesting tradition about Mark is that they say he is called stumped, and he has a kind of defect that he find it very his hands are very thick. So possibly that's the reason why his gospel is so short, and not just because of Romans, but he cannot write long stories. It takes a big effort for him to write, so he has to be very, very selective to write down the stories that he has written, and what to leave out, what to leave in. And one of the key things is how to a story of Jesus, his his teachings, his parables, and his doings, they're focused on how to be faithful in the face of persecution. And that may explain why the Gospel of Mark did not have a resurrection story. If you look at Matthew, there's a story of resurrection. Matthew, Luke has, but Mark ended up with the women running away from the angel after they went to the tomb, and the angel says he's not there, he's risen, but there was no appearances of Jesus to the disciples. And the women were told to go and tell the disciples, tell the rest. But the women ran and they didn't say anything. Right? Now, some found that in very what we called and dissatisfying. So later on, there were other verses that was added to show that there was a resurrection appearance. But those verses from verses 9 to 20 were later additions to the Gospel of Mark. The original Gospel of Mark ended with verse 8, when the women ran away and were silent and did not tell the disciples. Of course, we know that eventually they told, and eventually Jesus appeared. But in the matter of the story itself, the book itself, it ended in suspense. The story doesn't tell about the resurrection appearances. It gave the promise that he will go before you in Galilee. There was. So in that sense, in the sense of church, and there's a promise that there's a resurrection. There's a promise that there will be deliverance. There'll be a promise that there will be what we call victory. But they might not see in their lifetime. Many of them will be executed, arrested. They might die, but they will not see that. So the story of Mark is interesting because it was written during a time of possibly impending persecution or increasing persecution of the church. A very, very short time during Nero in Rome, for Roman Christians. Okay. There are many, many reasons why we can speculate why the gospel was written. But one thing that probably I would say is that in the very first, okay. Well, in NIV say in Mark like the pragmatic Romans and when the record of his gospel stress action straightforward detailed account, most exciting collection of stories of just focusing especially on miracles he performed. That's true and all that. But in verse 1, chapter 1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Messiah. Okay, Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. Okay, and this phrase is very important. Okay. In Rome, and Augustus Caesar, and his descendants were seen to be the saviors of the world. The one who brought about Pax Romana, Roman peace. And the Roman emperor is considered a son of God. And he will be deified, he'll become God when he dies, if he's a good son. And so this is a political theology of the Roman Empire. The Roman emperor is the guarantor of universal peace and salvation. The Roman emperor is the Son of God. And he will be God. Mark's gospel says, and many times, the proclamation of the Roman emperor and as a son of God is called good news. So this is the good news that Caesar has brought about peace, brought about prosperity, brought about an economic wealth to the entire world, and also spiritual wealth, so to speak, even. But Mark says the good news, okay, is Jesus, who is the Christ, the Messiah, who is the Son of God, not Caesar. Okay? And so early in the Roman persecution, Christians were forced to say Caesar is Lord. The Christians refuse to say that. They say Jesus is Lord. Jesus Kurios. They say Kaiser Kurios. No. Jesus Kurios. Lord. And and many of them refusing to call Caesar Lord lose their life executed, crucified, or if the Romans, they're thrown to lion or thrown into the lion's dens, and in what we call in the circus, and they're crucified and burned, or they're beheaded, whatever it is. Many of them died for their faith. So Mark was written to show that Jesus is the Christ, which has a lot of meaning for the Jewish people. But more importantly, he is also the Son of God. So in the very beginning, you find that we will look at this when it comes to chapter 1, and also a preview of chapter 15. And when there was a confession that Jesus' baptism, that God says, "This is my beloved Son." God testified of Jesus is my Son. And then at the end of the gospel, a Roman centurion, a Roman soldier, declares, "This is truly the Son of God." So the gospel is not just about evangelism, how to go to heaven. It is to declare in the face of Roman religious, theological politics. It is not Caesar. It is not, it is Jesus who is the Son of God. In today's terms, we say it's not Trump that is the Son of God. It is Jesus who is the Son of God. It's not Putin, the Son of God. It is Jesus, Son of God. It's not Z, and it's not Anwar, but it's Jesus, the Son of God. That is a very important purpose of the Gospel of Mark. Okay, now, and let me just stop by giving you the little video. Then okay, let's see where I am. Oops, so no, this is not this one. Okay, where am I sharing? Share.
The Gospel of Mark is a book in the Bible about the life of Jesus, and the earliest reliable tradition tells us that it was written by a guy named John Mark.
Now, Mark didn't just grab a bunch of random stories about Jesus and throw them together. He's designed this book to address some really specific questions about whether or not Jesus was the Jewish Messiah.
So let's stop right there, because that's a term a lot of people like me aren't very familiar with.
Yeah, so the Messiah was a royal figure, sometimes called the Son of God, that Israel was expecting to come and set up a kingdom here on earth. And around the time of Jesus, Israel was occupied by Rome, and so many Jews were hoping that the Messiah would come and overthrow the Romans and rule as king.
But Jesus didn't overthrow the Romans. In fact, he was killed by them.
And that brings us to the very issues Mark is trying to get at in this book. So in the first half, he focuses on who Jesus is. Is he really the Messiah? And then in the second half, he's addressing how Jesus became the Messianic King. And then right here in the middle of the book is this pivotal story that brings the two halves together, and Jesus answers both of these questions.
Okay, so let's talk about the first half of the book, who Jesus is.
So Mark makes his beliefs about Jesus very clear from the first line of the book. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God.
One of the next stories is Jesus getting baptized, and God's voice announces from heaven, "This is my son." So it couldn't be more clear. It's presenting Jesus as the Messiah.
Yes, but as you're reading through this first half of Mark, you'll notice something really interesting start to happen. Jesus is going about healing all these different people, and he's constantly telling them to keep quiet about who he is. This happens so many times in Mark's account. It's very strange.
Yeah, why keep it a secret?
So remember, lots of Jews had lots of different expectations about what the Messiah would be and do. And so Jesus doesn't want people to misunderstand what it means for him to be Israel's Messiah. And so with all that in mind, we come now to the pivotal story at the center of the book, where Jesus takes his disciples away and he asks them, "Who do you all say that I am?"
And Peter says what everyone's been saying, "You're the Messiah, the Son of God."
But then something new happens, because Jesus starts explaining to them how he's going to become the Messianic King, and it is not what they expected. He says he's going to suffer and die and rule by becoming a servant, or in his words, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Peter is startled by this, and he rebukes Jesus because there's no way he's going to let Jesus die. And Jesus responds, "Get behind me, Satan," which is really intense.
It really is. But it highlights how important it is for Jesus that his disciples come to understand who he really is. And so here, now in this pivotal section, Jesus tries 3 different times to have this conversation with them, and every time they respond in confusion and even fear.
Okay, so this launches us into the second half of the book, where Mark addresses the question of how Jesus becomes the Messianic King. It's the last week of Jesus' life. He goes to Jerusalem, gets in conflict with the religious leaders, and gets arrested.
And he's put on trial as someone who's claiming to be the king of the Jews. He's even given a crown and a purple robe like a king would get, but it is all a cruel joke.
Then he's mocked and beaten and hung up on a cross where he dies.
And it's here in this crucial scene that we meet a new character.
A Roman soldier
who suddenly gets everything that's going on.
He says, "Surely this is the Son of God."
Which is crazy. It's an enemy who's first putting it all together, that Israel's Messianic King is the crucified Jesus.
That's the structure of the book of Mark. But the book doesn't end with Jesus dead on the cross.
No. So on the 3rd day, some women go to visit Jesus' tomb, only to find that it's empty. And then there's this angel standing there, instructing them to go and tell this good news that Jesus is alive from the dead. But instead, they run away and they don't tell anyone because they're afraid. And that's how the book ends.
Which is a really abrupt ending.
Yeah, it's so abrupt that later scribes did add an ending that brings more closure to the story. And you'll find that story in your Bible with a little footnote that says it was added much later. But Mark's a brilliant storyteller, and he's intentionally ended this book abruptly. So all through the book, the disciples have been confused about Jesus' plan to give up his life, the story in the middle, and now right here at the end. It's like Mark is acknowledging just how startling this claim really is. And he wants you, the reader, to wrestle with it for yourself. Is this crucified Jesus really the Messiah that they've been waiting for? We think the Bible is one grand, unified.
Yes, so we're making a video of the book of the very showing how it's designed and it's in for the overall story. You have to make food.
Okay. All right. I think that then the video is very helpful. Then emphasizes some of the things that I've already said. So then this is my first session with you, and if you have questions that come up you want to ask, then next week we will start with chapter 1. Okay, Keelan, Liping, Lawrence,
No questions, Pastor.
helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Lawrence?
No questions.
Okay, no questions. And
At the moment, no questions.
okay. And that's why I said, and I encourage you to read Mark from the beginning to the end to see the whole thing, because sometimes you read, one verse, a few verses here, you see the trees, but you don't see the forest. You see the very interesting details, but you don't see how everything got together. And Mark did not write the gospel to be read in passages. He wrote the gospel to be read and as a whole. Just as when I write a book, I don't write a book as the kind of devotion that you take one verse and of what I write every day, but you read the whole story. And that is the book of Mark. Okay. All right. Liping, Josephine, Derek. Anyone?
Nothing. It's okay.
Pastor, is there a possibility that this Matthew don't know Mark at all?
Unlikely. Because whole sections of Mark's gospel is copied on into. It's like this, if you go to the exam to copy from somebody, I can show you that you copied from. You cannot say the Holy Spirit gave me, because the exact words are used, word for word is used, and the structure is the same, and so John writes a totally different story. Okay, so for Matthew and Luke to say that they don't know Mark is quite difficult to believe. Some would say that Mark actually summarizes Luke, Matthew, and but it's more likely that Mark was written first and then Matthew, and there are a lot of possible reasons, and we will look at some of them as we study in more detail. Why then there are better reasons for Mark and Matthew to be Mark to be copied by Matthew and added by Matthew with other material. The same thing we go to Luke. Okay. All right. Okay. Write down your questions and in a notebook, or in case you forget it. And one of the things that I think that challenges and for teaching the gospel is that many people don't feel that we know the gospels. We read it so often, and so familiar, and we can learn nothing new. Then, but I can tell you that this can be a very interesting way, and you might point that you will see things that you have never really paid attention to. That gives you an insight into how creative a writer this Mark is, whoever he is, and whether it's John Mark, or as my professor thinks he is some anonymous person, and which could be very likely, because in today we like to identify ourselves, and we put into the front piece that this is the work of so and so, and copyrighted, things like that. Authorship is very, very, very important, and we need to get credit, things like that. But in the first century, people are less conscious about authorship and credit. They are more concerned with the content, the truthfulness of what they have written. Okay, and that only 4 gospels of about 200 or more gospels that were circulating in those days were considered authentic gospels. There were many, many gospels that were written, more than 200 over. And we don't know most of them because they are rejected and nobody copy them anymore, except for some fringe groups. And but these stories were copied and copied and copied and copied and copied and retained the major four. And of course, later on, theologians will say there must be only 4 gospels because there are only 4 winds, and the north, south, east, west. There are 4 corners, and so there are 4 horsemen, and then all kinds of what we call reasons, and they say there's only 4 gospels, and they're authentic and things like that. But there are basically, then people try to undergird that, and which tells concerning the thinking of those people of those days. But historically, and these 4 gospels survived because they were assessed and by the early church, not and by just the leaders, but the people. Say, you can say all you want to say, and the people who were listening to churches will say that this is, no, we have never heard this before, and we're going to check whether this is true or not, and this is not true. And so the early church, the gospel writers were very serious, were very devout men, and they're very careful when they're writing the stories that they do not try to falsify the stories. But they had a bit of freedom of how they tell the story. And you will find that, and if you compare the stories of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they are slightly different ways to tell the story, and quite different sometimes. Okay, but essentially the same. Okay. All right. That's it. Pastor Knight.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you, Pastor.
See you all next week.
Next week. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Try to read.
Thank you, Pastor.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Okay.
Thank you, Pastor. Good night. Good night, everyone.